Now, quasi-experimental designs, as I'm sure you know, have a lot of threats to internal validity. We've already been talking about these somewhat, and basically these are within subjects' designs to some degree. Even if we might be comparing multiple groups, we're usually getting multiple time point measurements from each group, right? So we're using each group as their own control group to some degree for some comparisons. All the same risks that we had back in within subjects designs are kind of coming back up in quasi-experimental designs. We have issues of subject attrition. The more time points we have to measure from each person, all these multiple baselines and multiple post tests, it's really hard to do that. We're at risk of people just dropping out and not giving us the data, not following up with us. And that's particularly a problem for time series and pre-test, post-test analysis. How do we fix it? That's really difficult. You can build kind of a relationship with your participants where you are contacting them kind of frequently to remind them. Incentives help. So maybe they could get more money for completing the whole thing versus just for getting paid for each piece. But that's a big threat to our internal validity, especially if we have multiple groups. What if we had more people drop out in one group compared to another one? We might only be left with certain types of people that are not very representative. That makes our results really difficult to make conclusions about. We can also have a selection bias, and this is kind of similar. We can have pre-existing differences between our experimental and control groups, and this happens a lot because we are not randomly assigning people to our independent variable. Pre-tests help us control for that. So we can see what their levels were to begin with, and then see whether they changed from their initial point. So even if our groups were not the same, we can still see if they changed the same amount or a different amount. Time series analysis is another way of fixing that, kind of the best way of addressing that confound. We can also have what's called testing effects, which is a big problem in time series design. And this just means that our participants might get better at taking a test instead of their dependent measure actually changing. History effects are kind of similar. That's a confound that comes from an event outside of the study that happens at the same time that we're measuring a dependent variable that could be messing up our DV measurement. So imagine I have some kind of in-school intervention to reduce kids' anxiety, and I'm looking at two different schools. Imagine that a big thunderstorm hit one of the schools, but not the other one. So that may affect the anxiety in that school. That has nothing to do with my independent variable I'm manipulating there, but it's going to affect my anxiety measurements, my dependent variable. Let's imagine that I was looking at the effectiveness of an anti-smoking ad campaign, and I wanted to see if the smoking ad reduced smoking frequency in a couple of groups of participants. But imagine that around the time that we conducted the study, the US Surgeon General issued a new warning about how bad smoking is. Like they kind of put out their own messaging. And maybe that, instead of the ad campaign, could have affected the changes in the amount of cigarettes smoked that I measured in my study. That would be an example of a history effect. And that's all I've got for y'all this week in terms of material. Remember again to read about quasi-experimental designs in Chapter 8 of your Schweigert text and read about single subject designs in Chapter 12. You will also need to complete 2 lab assignments, and I'll describe each of those in turn here. Lab assignment 11 is an outline of your introduction to your survey research paper. So you'll use that information from last week's lecture that Dr. Hayes talked about, where she explained how to write an introduction, plus this information I'm giving you here, and an example outline that I'm going to post. So you're going to write a bulleted outline of your introduction and literature review. I want you to put citations next to topics for articles that you have already. So let's say all those articles you gathered for lab assignment 8, some of those will already kind of fit into natural categories. Like here's articles about my independent variable. Here's articles about my dependent variable. Here's articles about measuring both of those together. So you can kind of start grouping those naturally by their topic on your outline, and that can help give you a structure to your literature review. I also want you to not just put bullet points. I do want you to draft a single paragraph in here. The current study paragraph that goes at the very end of the literature review, right before a method section would start. Again, look at my posted example outline that's going to have comments walking you through how to generate something similar. And remember that for your final paper, it's going to be a little different than some of the stuff Dr. Hayes was saying in her lecture. So just keep this in mind. She was talking about writing results and discussion, which you are not going to do. Your literature review is going to be a little longer than the one she described because of that, so that you can still write around a 10-page paper. But we don't really have time for y'all to conduct your survey research project like we do when we teach this as an in-person class. So you're going to need around 10 sources instead of the 5 that she says, and around 5 pages of introduction and literature review instead of the 2 to 3 that she says. And then your other lab assignment is 12, your final one, by the way. We are about to be done with these. Your lab assignment 12 is a draft of your survey questions themselves. So turn in a draft of all questions that you plan to put in your survey, independent variable, dependent variable, demographics, etc. Check out any feedback I have about lab assignment 9. We're in the process now of compiling all those survey questions that y'all posted, and we're going to kind of group them together and give feedback on which are good question wordings and which ones might need some work, some issues that you might need to watch out for. So keep an eye out for that, because it will help you do a better first rough draft of your survey questions. So that is all I've got for y'all now, and I hope you have a good week. Let me know if you have any questions.